Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Kristen.
And my name is Katie. And we want to spend a few minutes a day with you walking through the New Testament, one chapter at a time. This year, we will fix our gaze upon Christ so that we may know him, not only with our minds, but with our hearts.
Together, we will learn that who Jesus is changes everything.
Hi, and welcome back to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Katie, and we are studying the New Testament together this year in 2024, and I cannot wait to continue through the book of Mark with you. Today, we are studying chapter 11. With chapter 11, we have come to an important section in Mark's gospel, Jesus' ministry in Jerusalem. These last few chapters will cover the week leading up to Jesus' crucifixion, which is sometimes referred to as Holy Week. A week that ends with his resurrection on Sunday, but begins the Sunday prior with Palm Sunday, a day when Jesus triumphantly rode into Jerusalem on a colt. And that's the scene that kicks off Mark 11. Mark begins by telling us that Jesus and his followers are approaching Jerusalem. This is a bit of an ominous detail, because in the previous chapter, Jesus told us that it would be in Jerusalem where he would suffer and die. But knowing what lays ahead of him and why he came, Jesus presses on and arranges to enter Jerusalem on a colt. And the crowds love it. They litter the ground before Jesus with their cloaks and with branches, indicating the arrival of a king and a deliverer. They recognize that Jesus is the Messiah, though, like the disciples, they probably don't quite grasp what kind of Messiah Jesus is. In their minds, they are probably thinking that he will deliver them from Rome. But Jesus is here to deliver them from deeper captivity to sin and to death. Right after Jesus' entrance into Jerusalem, in verse 11, we see that Jesus enters the temple courts, looks around for a little bit, and then he leaves. At first glance, this might appear to be a little throwaway comment that Mark didn't need to include, but it's actually quite significant. Why? At the very beginning of the gospel, Mark quoted from Malachi 3. In its original context, Malachi prophesied about a messenger who will prepare the way for the Lord, who is going to return to his temple as a refiner. And as the last verse of Malachi makes clear, if Israel is unrepentant, then the Lord is coming, and that will mean judgment. We've seen in Mark's gospel that John the Baptist is a messenger who prepares for the Lord's arrival, and that Jesus is that Lord. And so now we watch as Jesus, as spoken of in Malachi, comes to the temple in Jerusalem. If there's a common theme in Mark 11, 12, and 13, it's the temple. Here in Mark 11:11, we see Jesus inspecting the temple that is his by right. And Malachi helps us to appreciate the next scene, where Jesus is bringing judgment to the temple in form of overturning the tables of money changers. The temple, he says, is supposed to be a house of prayer for the nations, but it has become a den of thieves. This comment about den of thieves is especially ominous. These are words from Jeremiah 7, a chapter in which God strongly rebukes the false worship that's happening inside the temple. Essentially, God's people would go through the motions of worshiping him in the temple, but it would be empty ritualism. And as a response, God then said that judgment would be coming to the temple. By quoting these words, Jesus is saying that the history is repeating itself. Israel's religion is empty, it's worthless, and because of this, judgment will soon come. This scene in the temple is sandwiched between an account of Jesus cursing a fig tree. Mark likes to write this way: start the scene, move to another scene, and then return to the first scene. It's his way of telling us to read about Jesus' actions in the temple in light of his actions with the fig tree, which are sort of acted out prophecy of the temple. In passages like Jeremiah 8:13 and Hosea 9:16-17, passages which talk about God's judgment on Israel, the nation of Israel is compared to a withered fig tree that should have borne fruit, but it didn't. In a similar way, Israel's religious leaders in Jesus' day should have been modeling God's character for the nations around them, but they weren't. And cursing the fig tree is therefore a picture of judgment that will come on Israel. Now, you better believe that Jesus' actions in the temple were going to be challenged. And sure enough, when he returns to the temple at the end of Mark 11, he is confronted by chief priests, the teachers of the law, and elders who demand to know by what authority he can start flipping over tables. But Jesus then challenges them. He asks whether John's ministry had been from heaven or not. The obvious answer, which they won't admit, is that it is from heaven. John had God's stamp of approval on his ministry. But since John was merely preparing the way for Jesus, that must mean Jesus had God's stamp of approval as well. So then, by what authority does Jesus have to flip over tables? By the authority of God, who owns the temple. What can we behold of Jesus in Mark 11? How about his anger? Now, this is something that we don't always consider when thinking about Jesus. Maybe we don't like to think of him as angry, but consider what he is angry at. He's angry at hypocritical worship, the so-called worship that says the right things but goes through the motions, the kind of worship that's empty. Maybe you've seen this up close. Maybe you've been hurt by people who say that they love God but don't act like it. If that's you, take comfort in the picture of Jesus flipping over tables, that he is furious when people who claim to speak for God look nothing like him. But also, take a look inside your own heart. All of us are hypocritical in some way. All of us struggle with sin while we try to follow Jesus. Just like the temple was divided in worship, our hearts can be divided in worship too. But this will not always be the case. One day, when we finally behold Jesus face to face, we will receive a new body, and we will finally be free from sin once and for all. And what a glorious day that will be. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. Don't forget to check out the show notes for helpful links and resources related to today's episode. And make sure you are following at Daily Grace Podcast on Instagram for more A Year in the Bible content, and at the Daily Grace Co. for all things Bible study resources. We can't wait to study again with you tomorrow. Bye, friends.